I never knew what it was like to be anything but small, but the moment I was born or created, I suppose, is a blur. One moment I was not, and the next I was inside her stomach, a vast, dark, pulsating world that felt as infinite as any sky could feel to a tiny creature like me. I remember the first sensation, warmth, a heat that enveloped me like a blanket, gentle and comforting, yet so unfamiliar. It was a quiet sort of warmth, the kind you would feel from the softest of fires, where the flames never burned too fiercely, but rather curled around you, urging you to rest. But I couldn't rest, not at first. I was too small to grasp what had happened or why it had happened. The place I had found myself in was not like anything I could understand. There were no walls, no boundaries, just the constant rhythmic movement, the slow, undulating shift of her body as it did its work. My surroundings were like an enormous, undulating cavern, alive and pulsing with a force that I couldn't see, but could feel with every slight tremor. The first few moments felt like an eternity, each one stretching out, as I lay in the soft expanse surrounded by her warm flesh. I felt so fragile, so infinitesimally small. The space around me seemed enormous, like I had somehow become lost in a labyrinth of flesh and fluid. I was adrift, nothing more than a speck caught in an endless sea. But the waves were gentle and the currents, though strong, didn't carry me away. I remained, floating in this warm, ever-moving place. There was a constant sound here, too. A hum, a low, steady thrum that resonated in the deepest parts of me. It was the beat of her heart. At first, it frightened me. It felt so immense, like the pounding of a massive drum in a far-off land. But it also brought a strange sense of security. It was steady, unchanging. It was her, alive, and I was part of her in some strange, inexplicable way. I didn't understand how I had come to be here, how I had ended up in this warm, dark place. I tried to remember, tried to think of anything before this, but there was nothing. Only the space inside her, and the warmth that seemed to cradle me with a tender care that I couldn't fully comprehend. All I could do was listen to the rhythmic pulsing of her heartbeat, feel the slow, gentle movement of her stomach as she went about her life. I was like a passenger inside her body, moving along with her, though she would never know I was there. And then something remarkable happened. She ate. The sensation was almost like a great shift, a movement in the world around me. I felt the pressure, first gentle, then growing as the food she had swallowed began its journey. A soft weight pressed in from all sides, like the earth closing in around a seed. It was comforting in a way, though strange. I had no way of knowing what it was she had eaten, but I could feel the food enter her stomach, making its way to me, disrupting the otherwise calm, smooth motions. It didn't frighten me, at least not in a way I could define. It was more of a curiosity. What was this new thing, this sensation that had changed the environment around me? What was the purpose of this? I felt small bits of food, grainy, soft, and foreign, float by me. Some were larger than I was, some smaller. They moved with the currents, like driftwood floating along a river, and I couldn't help but study them. They were a strange sight, but in a way, they were my company, the closest thing to interaction I had. I played with them, pushing them around like tiny boulders in a world that was far too vast for them to control. The food didn't stay long. It would dissolve, break down, become part of her, and I would be left with nothing but the faint aftertaste of something new. It was in these moments that I began to understand that the world inside her was not hostile to me, not immediately. It was unfamiliar, yes, but not an enemy. There were no threats in her stomach, no dangers lurking to end my life. No, in a strange way, this place was my home now, and while I was tiny, I felt as though I could survive here. Her stomach, her body, it was a living world of its own, and I was, for all intents and purposes, a part of it. It was in these early days that I learned the comfort of her digestion. The gentle rumbling of her stomach sounded like a lullaby, soothing in its predictability. There were times when I could feel the rise and fall of her breath, the gentle movement of her diaphragm, and I would press myself closer to her body, allowing her warmth to lull me into sleep. The world around me would shift and swirl, and I would close my eyes, letting the rhythmic movements carry me through the day. There was a quiet contentment in being so small, so insignificant, yet entirely part of something much greater. I did not need to understand it, and maybe I never would, but I had a place here in her. Though I remained unseen, though I remained unknown to her, I had already started to become something, a tiny part of her. The thought comforted me in a way I could not explain. I didn't know how I came to be here, nor did I know how long I would stay. But for now, I was hers, and I would survive in this strange, secret home, surrounded by her warmth, her heartbeat, her gentle digestion. I didn't need anything more, and so my life began. There were times, quiet moments when I could feel her stir, when she shifted her weight, when she moved from place to place, that I would wonder what lay beyond the thick, undulating walls of her body. The air in her stomach was warm and rich, filled with the soft, rhythmic sounds of her internal workings. But it wasn't all that I wanted. Even though I was so small, so insignificant in her world, there was an undeniable longing in me. I didn't know what the outside world looked like, but I knew it existed. I felt it in her movements, the way she would stand up straighter, her breath suddenly shifting, as if she was waking from a deep slumber. It wasn't until she let me out that I truly understood how vast the world really was. I first felt it one lazy afternoon when she sat down and stretched her limbs. The air around me grew fresher, lighter, and I knew something was about to change. It wasn't like the usual swells of digestion or the comforting warmth of her movements. This was different. This time, she let me crawl upward toward her throat. At first, the journey seemed impossible. Her throat was a dark, narrow passageway that I had to squeeze through carefully, feeling the walls of muscle contract with every step. The air grew warmer as I moved upward, and the path was rough, slick, and pulsing with the soft hum of her voice, though I couldn't hear her words. I was used to the smoothness of her stomach's inner surfaces, but the throat was more jagged. It was an uncomfortable climb, made worse by the constant gurgling sound of her own body's rhythms. But I knew I had to get through it. If I didn't, I would never know what lay outside her world. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of winding through her esophagus, I reached her mouth. It was like a massive cavern full of strange sounds and sensations. I hesitated for just a moment, heart pounding in my chest. The air was thin up here, so much colder than what I was used to. There was a rush of warmth as her breath exhaled, and I felt it sweep over me like a sudden gust of wind. I clung to the soft folds of her lips, peering out into the unfamiliar world. When I first found myself inside her mouth, perched just at the edge of her lips, the world seemed to expand in every direction, yet it felt impossibly close, as if the entire universe had been crammed into this one strange space. I had always wondered about this part of her body, what lay beyond the confines of her stomach, the place that had been my home. Now, standing at the precipice of her lips, I could hardly comprehend what I was about to witness. The air here was different, thinner and drier than the soft, rich air in her stomach, but it carried a faint taste of sweetness, the remnants of the meals she had consumed. Her breath was warm and carried a scent of life itself, something both comforting and alien. A constant flow of air as she exhaled softly. Her lips were like great, soft hills, pink and inviting. To me, they were massive, each lip larger than my entire body, soft and slightly textured, like the surface of the smoothest suede. The curvature of her lips framed her mouth like a monumental doorway. I could feel the heat radiating off them, the warmth of her life flowing through them. I stood there for a moment, eyes wide, heart racing with both excitement and terror. But curiosity was stronger than fear. I had come this far, and the outside world was within reach. I peered inside the vast cavern of her mouth, feeling the pull of it, the intrigue, the strange, almost playful force that beckoned me deeper. Her teeth were towering, jagged cliffs that stretched up into the high ceilings of her mouth. They were larger than any mountain I could have imagined, sharp and smooth, yet warm from the breath that filled the air. Each tooth seemed to have its own personality, some smooth and curved, others rough and pointed. They were like ancient, majestic stone pillars that could crush me without a second thought, yet they were strangely beautiful to me. I marveled at the intricate ridges, the glossy enamel, the way the light shimmered off their surfaces. The texture of her gums was soft but firm, a deep, fleshy pink that looked almost like a living carpet under my tiny feet. I could feel the pulse of her heartbeat in the subtle movements of her tongue, which lay at the bottom of her mouth, waiting patiently. Her tongue was a vast, soft terrain, smooth and wet. It was as wide as a small meadow to me, and I couldn't help but feel that I was standing on the edge of a great organic landscape, something both familiar and wild. The air tasted of warmth and life. There was a slight tang of the food she had recently eaten, a mix of flavors that was both foreign and comforting. I didn't understand all of it, but there was a richness to the air in her mouth that felt like it came from the very essence of her being. It was the kind of warmth that made me feel at home, safe in my tiny world. Though the space was immense to me, it was also a place where I could not resist playing. I began to scurry across her tongue, a small figure in a huge organic playground. The surface of her tongue was slick but soft beneath my feet, its wetness making each step feel like a gentle glide. I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. This was new. It wasn't as confined as the walls of her stomach, nor was it as frightening as the outside world. Here, I was free to explore in a way that felt more like an adventure. I imagined myself as a tiny explorer, racing across the smooth surface of her tongue, weaving between the soft ridges and crevices that formed beneath my tiny body. Sometimes, I would leap from one side of her mouth to another, marveling at how far I could jump compared to my size. Her lips, still open just enough for me to crawl freely, offered a border that I could cling to, using them as a safe boundary when I wanted to rest. I could hear her faint laughter vibrating through the space, though she wasn't even aware of my existence. Her mouth, though silent, was alive with the subtle movements of her muscles, like a living, breathing ecosystem in which I was a tiny part. I played, running and tumbling across the vast landscape of her mouth, careful not to venture too far toward the back. There was always a risk. I knew that the throat might pull me in too quickly, swallowing me into her next passage without warning. But for now, I was content with the soft, familiar rhythm of her mouth, the way her tongue would flick and roll slightly, pushing her teeth together with the gentlest click, the slight taste of her saliva on my lips as I ran across her tongue. The warmth of her mouth was a constant presence, and there was something intoxicating about it. The slow, steady movement of her jaw was like the rocking of a cradle. I could feel her lips pressed together, her teeth moving subtly as she spoke, but there was a gentle, almost musical quality to her mouth. Every motion was an orchestra of small actions that were so grand to me. I would play for what felt like hours, crawling along the ridges of her teeth, weaving between the spaces where the food she ate sometimes lodged, tiny remnants of her life that had become part of this space. I'd dive into a crevice between her teeth, pretending it was a hidden cave, or slip between the cracks like a brave adventurer in a vast and undiscovered land. It was a playful place for me, one of discovery and wonder. But there was always the knowledge that this too was part of her vast and complicated world that I was now a part of. I knew that the space between her teeth was temporary, that the inside of her mouth wasn't a place I was meant to stay. Still, for as long as I was there, it was the most exhilarating part of my tiny existence. For a moment, I forgot about how small I was. I forgot about the enormity of the outside world, and how I never truly belonged there. Here, inside her mouth, I felt a joy that was bigger than fear. In the vastness of her body, I had found a world to call my own, a place where I could be free, if only for a short while. As I crawled back toward the safety of her lips, ready to retreat back into the softness of her throat, she opened her mouth slightly, and then I saw it. At first, the light was blinding. The world outside seemed like a bright, overexposed landscape, too bright, too expansive. I squinted against the harsh sunlight, but it still felt like the entire world was pressing in on me. The sky above was so vast that I couldn't comprehend its edges, and the ground beneath was a sprawling sea of grass and dirt stretching endlessly. I was so small. I was nothing here. I watched as the wind stirred the trees, their branches reaching far above my tiny head like the arms of giants. Birds soared through the sky, their wings a blur of motion as they glided effortlessly on invisible currents of air. I had never seen anything like it. Every movement outside felt monumental. A leaf fell from a tree, and it tumbled down toward the ground like a boulder. I instinctively flinched, afraid it might crash into me. The blades of grass, so tall and thick to me, swayed gently in the breeze. And I could hear it all, each whisper of the wind, every rustle of the leaves, each footstep of people walking far below. I was so small, I wasn't even a speck in the face of all this vastness. And then I saw something even more terrifying. A shadow loomed over me. At first, it was distant, far away, and I tried to dismiss the growing sense of unease. But the shadow grew larger, moving closer. My heart raced in my tiny chest, my breath quickened as the enormous footfall of something heavy approached. The sheer size of it made me freeze. The world around me shifted as if a great weight was pressing down. I looked up and the vast figure of a giant human being, a massive woman, loomed over me. Her body, larger than anything I could imagine, cast a shadow that enveloped me. I could feel the pulse of her steps reverberating through the earth, each movement causing the ground beneath me to tremble. The woman's face was miles above me, a towering presence that seemed as indifferent to me as a passing cloud. Her eyes, though, they were enormous, and when they blinked, I could feel the wind rushing around her lashes. Her gaze swept over the world, unaware of the tiny figure standing beneath her. Her presence filled me with fear. I had never known anything to be so large, so unapproachable. The woman wasn't even aware of my existence. I was nothing to her, not even a fleeting thought. To her, I was less than a speck of dust, a microscopic organism that could be easily ignored. I had never felt so insignificant. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The outside world, so beautiful and expansive, was a place where I didn't belong. Here, I was a fragile, tiny thing in a place where everything was too big to be understood. Even the air felt overwhelming, and the world spun around me as I struggled to comprehend its vastness. I was nothing more than an afterthought, something that could easily be overlooked. The woman's steps became more distant as she walked away, leaving me in the silence that followed. My body shook with the sheer scale of everything, my tiny form so fragile in the face of it all. I realized then that I was safer where I had come from. Inside her, in the warmth and security of her body, there were no terrifying giants, no overwhelming world that could crush me with a single step. I crawled back toward her throat, retreating into the darkness where I felt smaller but safer. The air inside was thick with warmth again, and the rumbling of her stomach was a steady, calming sound that told me I was home. I didn't belong in the outside world. Not yet, at least. I couldn't understand it. It was too big, too chaotic. I would rather stay inside her, nestled in the familiar, comforting darkness of her body, than face the overwhelming, vast world that lay beyond her. And so, I settled back into the folds of her stomach, grateful for the warmth and safety that surrounded me. The outside world would remain a distant curiosity, a place that I couldn't yet understand. Some days I enjoyed venturing out to her intestines for a nice stroll. The intestines, to most, might seem like a place of discomfort, a long, winding pathway of digestion and waste. But for me, they were an entirely different world, one of mystery and playful exploration. It was the part of her body I ventured to when I wanted to experience the more curious side of her being, the part where I could roam freely without the crushing weight of her stomach pressing against me. There, in the dark recesses of her inner workings, I was free to play. The journey down was never easy, not that I minded. Every climb or crawl deeper into her body felt like an adventure. The walls around me were slick, moist, and alive with movement. I would scramble between them, my tiny feet barely finding purchase as the rhythm of her breathing shook the world around me. The passageways were not quite straight. They twisted and turned, curved in ways I could never have imagined. Some parts of her intestines were wide enough for me to stand tall and move with ease. Others were so narrow I had to squeeze my body through, pressing against the smooth, undulating walls. The air down here was thick with the scent of her body, earthy and primal. It wasn't unpleasant. There was a richness to it, as if I could feel the essence of her life swirling around me in every breath. At times, I would stop and let the sounds of her body wash over me. The soft rumble of her digestive organs, the gentle gurgles that signaled the constant processing of food, the pulsing rhythm of life itself, all intertwined in a symphony I had come to know as the heartbeat of the inner world. I would often take little breaks, sitting on bits of food that had made their way down with her. Sometimes it was just crumbs, small remnants of meals she had eaten earlier in the day. Other times, there were slightly larger bits, pieces of fruit or vegetables, their forms still recognizable in their disintegration. I would touch them, sometimes in wonderment at how they had traveled so far within her, sometimes with a playful curiosity as I poked at their soft, semi-digested surfaces. The food would be slick, but there was a certain comfort to it, as though it was just another part of the world inside her, one that had come and gone, like all things that passed through her body. I would sometimes gather the bits of food, pushing them together like some strange puzzle, finding strange joy in creating small, temporary homes out of their remnants. And then there was the strange, almost magical sensation of the bowel's natural rhythm. It was like a pulse, something larger than me, moving me forward even when I was not actively trying to go anywhere. The walls of her intestines would contract in slow, methodical waves, guiding me, pushing me, coaxing me deeper into her. It was an odd kind of comfort, the sense that even though I was small and alone, I was part of something that never stopped moving, a process as ancient as time itself. There were sections where the walls seemed to pulse in a slower, more deliberate manner, almost like they were inviting me to rest. I would lie down, letting the gentle movement of her intestines rock me like a cradle. Sometimes, the waves of her digestive process were so rhythmic that I would fall asleep there, nestled against the walls of her, feeling safe and secure, my tiny form utterly at peace. The inner world was my sanctuary, but as I wandered further into her bowels, the terrain began to change. The smell grew stronger, more pungent, as the food inside me began to break down further. At first, I was curious, watching the change with fascination. Then, the deeper I went, the more daunting the task of exploration became. The air here was thick, and the darker corridors of her intestines felt more foreboding. Still, I didn't mind. I felt an undeniable pull to continue, as if her body was encouraging me to see it all, to witness every inch of her, no matter how uncomfortable. One day, I ventured to a part of her intestines where I had never been before, a part so far down, the walls were rougher, and the motion more intense. Here, the environment was harsher, the very walls pulsing as they moved food along her system. I had to brace myself against the force of the contractions, gripping the smooth, shifting walls to avoid being swept away. It was in these moments that I felt the vulnerability of my existence. I was so small, and yet it seemed as though I was being guided along, as if the path was always predetermined, and I was just a passenger on a journey I could not escape. I could feel the changes in her body as well. At times, when she was in the middle of digestion, I would notice that her entire system was more active, more alive. There was a slight increase in pressure, the walls tightening in waves, forcing the remnants of food through the labyrinth of her intestines. And as the food moved through, the sound was like a distant thunderstorm rumbling from deep within her. Even in these darker moments, I never felt entirely afraid. Her body was a part of me. It was where I had spent my life, after all, nestled inside her, playing in her intestines, hearing her heartbeat. I felt connected to her in a way that was impossible to describe, a link that transcended the normal bounds of size and space. I wasn't just a tiny man. I was a part of her, a tiny fragment of the great machine that powered her life. The most wondrous thing, though, was when the tension of the intestines would begin to release, and I would be gently moved along again, pushed further into the depths. Every twist and turn felt like a new adventure, a new discovery. It was as though I was traveling through the very essence of her, her core, her being, and I would be remiss not to cherish every moment of it. There was play, too, in the ways I would find myself tumbling with the flow of things, rolling like a leaf caught in the river's current. It was an odd sort of amusement, like being caught in a game that I didn't understand but couldn't resist. The unpredictable motion of her body kept me on my toes, but it also made me laugh, sometimes small chuckles rising up from my chest as I swirled along with the currents of her intestines, feeling like I was a part of something infinitely bigger. Despite everything, I never feared being lost. Even when I ventured far from the safety of her stomach or the comforting rhythm of her heartbeat, I knew I would always be guided back, like a child cradled in the arms of a loving mother. The intestines were not just a place of digestion. They were a world all their own, mysterious, chaotic, and yet utterly familiar. And so I continued to play there, my tiny form dancing with the currents, exploring the depths of her body, content in the knowledge that, despite all the vastness of the outside world, there was no place I'd rather be than nestled within her, lost in the joy of her hidden, playful interior. There was no place more sacred to me than the softness of her chest. The moment I found my way there, nestled between the folds of her warmth, I felt as though I were in a sanctuary. It was a place where the outside world ceased to exist, and I was nothing more than a tiny speck in the comforting embrace of her body. Her chest was vast, soft, and full of gentle curves that seemed to cradle me without effort. The skin there was smooth, warm, and welcoming, like the plushest fabric, rich with the scent of her natural essence. It smelled like life itself, faintly sweet, earthy, and entirely hers. This place, her chest, was the closest I could get to her heart, to the core of who she was, and in that space, everything felt right. The deep, rhythmic pulse of her heart reverberated through her ribcage, sending waves of warmth that swelled around me, like the ocean lapping gently against the shore. I had often thought of her chest as the heart of her, a beating place, full of life and energy, the very source of her existence. The sound of her heart was a steady, comforting drumbeat that I had grown to rely on. It was like the world's most perfect lullaby, its deep thrum vibrating through the soft, pillowy flesh that enveloped me. There was something profoundly reassuring about it, something timeless. I would press my tiny body into the curve of her breast, where the warmth seemed to surround me completely, as though the heat came not just from her skin but from her very soul. The space between her breasts, where I often made my home, was like a natural nest. It was tucked away, nestled in the center of her chest, where the curve of her ribs met the soft swell of her skin. This hollow, a gentle valley in the landscape of her body, was a world of its own. The heat radiated from her body, and I could feel it seeping into every part of me, warming me, protecting me. The folds of her flesh were not just comforting but felt like a soft, living cushion. It was as though she herself had created a perfect little world for me to exist within. I would curl up between her breasts, finding comfort in their plushness. The natural pressure of her body, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, would shift the world around me in a slow, rhythmic dance. When she would inhale deeply, the space I occupied would swell with the air she drew into her lungs, pushing me ever so slightly upward, only to fall again as she exhaled, as though the very act of breathing was a shared experience between us. It was here, in this place, that I felt most at peace, as if I were cradled in her very essence. The warmth of her body surrounded me like a protective cocoon, sheltering me from all the worries of the world. The darkness of the space was never oppressive. In fact, it was comforting in its quietude. There was no harsh light, no overwhelming sounds, only the rhythmic beat of her heart, steady and constant, filling the silence around me. It was in this place that I truly felt close to her, connected in a way that no one else could understand. It was as if her heart were an extension of my own. I would sometimes close my eyes, allowing the deep pulse of her life to calm my mind, to let go of the fear of being so small in such a big world. The sensation of being so close to her warmth, to the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, was unlike anything else I had known. It felt like home in a way that nothing ever had before. And within that warmth, I was safe. The light from the outside world was a faint memory when I was there. Her chest, with its soft curves and deep, comforting warmth, became my sanctuary, the place where I could hide away from the vast, frightening world beyond her body. There, I was more than just a tiny speck of life. I was part of something bigger, something infinitely more significant than I could ever understand. The connection between us was invisible, but it was undeniable. Her heartbeat was my heartbeat, her life was mine, and in that place, I had found peace. The softness of her breasts, the warmth of her chest, would become the center of my world, a place where time seemed to stand still, where nothing could harm me, where I could simply exist in the quiet, rhythmic beat of her life. Eventually, I would retreat back to the comforts of her stomach. Some days, out of boredom, I would poke her belly button with all my might. There was something utterly captivating about her belly button. It was a curious place, a small indentation in the vast landscape of her body. To me, it was a landmark, one of the many familiar spots I'd come to know as intimately as I knew the curves of her stomach or the steady pulse of her heartbeat. From inside her, it was a peculiar place, a gateway between the soft, warm expanses of her abdomen and the unknown world outside. When I ventured near her belly button, it felt like stepping into a tiny cavern, the skin stretched taut over the deep, round hollow. The walls of her body curved around me like a warm embrace, and as I pressed my tiny hands against the skin around the belly button, I could feel the vibrations of her movements. Each step, each breath, each shift of her posture resonating through the space. It was like being inside a living, breathing sculpture. I would sometimes push against the area just to feel the slight give of her skin, the way it would yield to my touch and then slowly return to its natural shape. It was a gentle tug, like a small dance between my fingers and her skin, and I often found myself mesmerized by the sensation. The belly button was not a soft spot, but a place of subtle resistance, like pressing against a cool stone that still held warmth. There were times when I would dare to tickle the edges of her belly button, my tiny fingers tracing the soft contours, nudging into the recesses with a playfulness that felt both daring and soothing. The sensation was strange. The way her skin would react to my touch, a soft ripple or a faint twitch, as if she could feel it even though she never knew I was there. Sometimes she would shift, or I would hear a muffled giggle from above, as if she were subconsciously aware of something brushing against her. It was a curious thing, the way her body responded to my tiny, invisible presence. When I tickled her just right, she might jerk slightly, a quick movement that would cause my tiny form to brace against her skin. Her body seemed to shiver ever so slightly, a wave of warmth pulsing through her, and I would retreat, laughing quietly to myself. It was a game I played often, though she would never remember or understand it. To her, it was just a sensation, a fleeting moment of comfort or discomfort. But to me, it was a way of reaching out to her, of connecting with her in a way words could never explain. And sometimes I would press harder, pushing against her belly button, trying to feel the soft give as I experimented with different pressures. The feeling of her skin stretching slightly under my touch was strangely satisfying. In the quiet, dark space of her stomach, this small ritual, tickling and pushing on her belly button, was my way of letting her know, in my own silent way, that I was here, a tiny presence in her world. It was a beautiful, gentle, and oddly intimate place. The belly button, a small indentation in the center of her vast body, became a spot I returned to often. It was not the most noticeable part of her, but it was always there, a quiet reminder that I existed within her, moving with her, a part of her in ways no one else could understand. I was getting more and more adventurous as the days passed. It started like any other day. I was exploring deeper into the twists and turns of her intestines, a place I had become familiar with, but never truly safe in. The walls were slick with moisture, the air thick with a pungent, almost sour smell. The deeper I ventured, the more the world felt unfamiliar, like a cavernous underworld I had no business exploring. But my curiosity often drove me, a tiny creature trying to make sense of the great unknowable body that was my home. But this time, something was different. The walls seemed tighter, the spaces narrower. The sounds were louder, more insistent. I heard her stomach growl faintly in the distance, a low rumble vibrating through the layers of flesh and muscle, but there was something off about it. It felt urgent, as if her body were speaking to me, warning me to turn back. But I didn't listen. I had gone too far. I could feel the changes around me before I saw them. The air became thicker, staler. The walls of the intestines, which had once felt like a secret labyrinth I could navigate with ease, now seemed to close in on me, the passageways narrowing with each step. My movements felt more sluggish, as though the very air around me had become viscous, holding me back. A strange chill crept down my spine, a feeling that there was something lurking just beyond my sight. The rhythmic contractions of her intestines, once reassuring, had become disorienting. I could hear the pulse of her digestive system, a slow, constant murmur like the beating of a giant's heart, but now it felt wrong. It was too slow, too heavy. The walls around me began to twitch, as though the very flesh of her body were alive in a way I had never understood before. Then it happened. I was walking, my tiny feet slipping on the slick surface of the intestine, when a sharp, sudden lurch knocked me off balance. My hands shot out to grab something, anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. The walls, once steady, now buckled around me, pressing in from every side. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly, lost in the vast, throbbing darkness of her insides. I was falling. The walls seemed to stretch out beneath me, a never-ending descent into the unknown. It wasn't the fall itself that terrified me, but the realization that I was no longer in control of where I was going. The walls squeezed tighter and tighter as I tumbled, helpless, like a grain of sand swept up in a storm. The flesh around me pulsed with cruel, rhythmic determination, pushing me deeper into the depths of her body. I could feel the heat now, intense, suffocating heat, and the unmistakable, acidic sting of her digestive juices rising up to meet me. It wasn't just the usual warmth of her body, it was something far more violent, something that threatened to devour me whole. Panic surged through me, my heart racing in time with the pounding of her pulse, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, and I was being pulled further and further into the belly of the beast. The smell, it was overwhelming, thick and rancid. It was as though the very air had turned toxic, stinging my eyes and making my skin crawl. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my legs were weak with terror. I pressed myself against the slick, undulating walls, trying to find something, anything, to stop the crushing force pulling me forward. But there was no escape. The intestines stretched endlessly in front of me, an unyielding tunnel leading only deeper into the dark, unfathomable depths of her body. Then I felt it, a sharp, searing pain. The walls of her intestines had tightened so much that they were almost crushing me. My chest felt heavy, my body pressing against the smooth, unforgiving surface. I could feel the acids now, the burning heat rising around me, and I screamed in agony as they began to dissolve my skin. It was like being swallowed by fire, the very insides of her body betraying me, as though I were nothing more than the food she had consumed, about to be broken down and discarded. My heart raced, thudding violently against my ribs, but it couldn't keep pace with the terror gripping me. The acids were everywhere now, a suffocating blanket that pressed against my skin, burning, eating away at my strength. My thoughts were fractured, clouded with pain and fear. I tried to pull away, to crawl, to move, but the walls around me had become an impenetrable cage. As I tumbled deeper into the swirling darkness of her intestines, the world around me began to close in. The soft, slick walls of her inner passages, once familiar and comforting, now felt like the constricting jaws of a beast. I fought to hold onto the remnants of my clothes, but it was no use. The digestive acids, a slow and unrelenting force, began their work, tugging at the fabric, pulling it away from my tiny body. My shirt, once a snug, comforting fit, now felt like a heavy, cumbersome weight. The fibers, so small they were barely visible to the human eye, began to disintegrate, breaking apart under the brutal pressure. I tugged at the fabric, but the more I fought, the faster it unraveled. Threads snapped like fragile twigs in a storm, and the once soft cotton tore away in strips. The material clung to my skin for only a moment longer before the acids dissolved it entirely, leaving me shivering, exposed to the unrelenting forces of her body. The pants I wore fared no better. The elastic waistband, so familiar and comfortable, suddenly felt like a noose tightening around me. I tried to wiggle free, but the digestive fluids were relentless. The waistband frayed, the seams gave way, and my trousers were shredded. Falling away in chunks, I felt the last remnants of fabric slip off my legs, and I was left naked, vulnerable against the walls of her insides. The worst of it, however, was the shoes. Tiny, insignificant shoes that had been my only protection from the overwhelming, slick environment. They clung to my feet for a while longer, but the acids eroded them with terrifying speed. The soles, once solid and secure, softened and began to peel away, the leather disintegrating into mush. My feet, which had once been shielded from the discomfort of the slick walls, now scraped painfully against the rough surface of her insides. It was a nightmare. With every passing moment, I felt smaller, weaker, and more helpless. The forces inside her, so much bigger and stronger than anything I could comprehend, were slowly stripping me of everything that had once made me feel whole. My clothes, the last trace of my identity, were reduced to tatters. I was a tiny man, now naked and helpless, lost in the vast, unforgiving maze of her body. But there was no escape. Her body was too big, too overwhelming. There was no place for me to hide, no corner where I could find safety. My clothes, my sense of self were gone, and as I continued my journey through her insides, stripped bare, I felt more and more like a mere fragment, a speck of dust in a world far too vast for me to survive in. I could feel the last remnants of my consciousness slipping away as her body began to digest me. My limbs grew weak, my body growing numb as the pain intensified. The air became thicker, harder to breathe. My thoughts were fading, replaced by a hollow, aching fear that I had gone too far, too deep. It was then, in the darkest part of her, that I realized something truly terrifying. I was no longer a part of her in a way I had once been. I was not safe inside her anymore. She had become my prison, and I was nothing more than a morsel, destined to be consumed by the very system that had once nurtured me. I felt the crushing weight of her insides closing around me. The acids burned, stinging my skin as they dissolved whatever remained of my belongings. I could feel the heat of the digestive process eating away at me. My body began to break down, dissolving into nothing. There was no escape, no way to turn back. I had become lost to the depths of her body, never to return to the warmth of her chest or the safety of her stomach. The last thing I remember before the darkness overtook me was the rhythmic, deafening sound of her digestive system, like the roar of a great beast. The thrum of her heartbeat faded into the distance, and then nothing. The world went black. I was gone. I was a tiny man living inside a giantess woman. She never knew I existed in the way I knew her. But the nutrients of my body will be a part of her forever, even if I was only a small part of another meal to be forgotten. The last thing I felt as my very being was consumed was a strange, bittersweet peace. I had loved her, and that love would be all that remained of me. A love she would never know, never feel. She would carry on as she always had, never realizing that in her world, there had once been a tiny man who was entirely hers. And in that final moment, as I became nothing, I whispered one last thought into the silence. I was yours.